They say they walked into the water. They say they walked into the water, and the water spirits took them back home. Or maybe they flew like fish over the water and returned to their home across the waves. That is a quote from Those Who Walked into the Water, an African American tale, which I wrote for the Safarnama project on Folkloristan. It is an adaptation of the folk tales of enslaved Africans escaping slavery through walking or flying into the ocean and or back to Africa. Who were the water spirits that enabled them to escape? It's time to find out. The rabbit hole goes far deeper and darker than you might expect. Before we dive into the deep, dark waters, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more content just like this. I also want to give a brief content warning for discussions of the transatlantic slave trade, genocide, and suicide. Today's video is a lot bigger and more complex than most in this series. I learned a ton of fascinating stuff, and I hope you'll find it fascinating too. The water spirits at the center of this video are the Bisimbi, singular Cymbee, also called Cymbees or Cymbees, spelling differences on screen, and Nkizimiamamba in Kikongo, which might be their original name. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation. The Bisimbi tend to live in bodies of fresh water, but are also associated with the Atlantic Ocean. They come from the mythology of the Congo people, a Bantu ethnic group that speaks the language Kikongo. The Congo people originally lived in the Kingdom of Congo on the Atlantic coast of Africa, but now reside primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, Angola, and Gabon. Belief in the Bisimbi also spread to the Americas because of the transatlantic slave trade, and I will cover that later in the video. The Bisimbi are conceived of as spirits, and as such are difficult to define. Do they have tails or feet, for instance? Or are they perhaps shapeshifters who can have either one? Or maybe they have feet sticking out of the bottom of their tails, like the OG Mesopotamian mer beings. That last option seems unlikely. I just thought I'd mention it for fun. More seriously, colonialism and racism have damaged many of the traditions that would enable us to know what the Congo people originally believed about the Bisimbi. Many of the sources, at least the ones I was able to get a hold of, are post-colonization or come from America, where the enslaved descendants of the Congo preserved some versions of the myths. From what I was able to glean though, they likely have fishtails. As I've discussed in many of my previous videos, human upper bodies and fishtail lower bodies are not unique to Europe, and in fact predate them. I think the Bisimbi also appear in a humanoid form as well. One source from a South Carolina enslaved person described them as having webbed feet like a goose. Source on screen and link in the description. There are species of geese, interestingly enough, that live in Africa, but also other webbed-footed animals. So while this description is likely reflective of its origin in South Carolina, the description is not distinct to South Carolina, and the Congo people could have described the Bisimbi in a similar fashion. I'm going to go on a tangent about the geese feet later on in the video, but I want to try to keep this organized. So anyway, this same source also said that they had long brown hair that they brush and that they were snake-like. If all this reminds you of Mami Wada, it reminds me too. I will discuss the possible connections later on in this video. Mermaids have also been seen in North Carolina, and they also brush their hair. Specifically, they were seen at Cape Fear River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean. Interestingly, Atlantic sturgeon, one of the biggest fish in the world, live in this river. Why is that interesting, you might ask? Well, Atlantic sturgeon are born in freshwater, head into the ocean, and then return to rivers to spawn. A life cycle I wonder if the Bisimbi follow as well. Another fascinating detail in the Cymbee water spirits of St. John's, Berkeley, is the claim that the Cymbees are proportionate in size to the spring, which implies a great amount of variation in size. There are a number of fish that continually grow until death, such as goldfish, rockfish, and sharks. Snakes, crocodiles, and Chinese giant salamanders, which as an aside are 5 feet long, also continue to grow for their whole lives. But I will speculate more on that in the biology section of the video. Another resource I utilized for envisioning what the Bisimbi might look like is a stunning art project, Cymbee, an Afro-Carolinian mermaid tale. On screen is art from this project. Note the small mouths, almost non-existent noses, and large, round black eyes, similar to my illustrations of the Nomo, Onijegi/Zen, and Mami Wada. When I saw these illustrations, I was instantly captivated. Features like the large eyes would help a creature like this see underwater, and are much more plausible than the Disney-fied images of mermaids we may have in our heads. If there are indeed merfolk, they probably look more like this than Ariel. The Bisimbi in Africa are related to, or may be, a type of Minkizi, which is a complex term that I probably don't fully understand. From what I've gathered though, the term is used both for spirits and for the ritual objects they inhabit. According to Nkizi figures of the Lower Congo, Nkizi being the singular of Minkizi, there were Minkizi of the water, which may refer to the Bisimbi. On screen are male and female Nikizi figures. As you can see, they are highly stylized. What can they tell us about the Bisimbi? Maybe nothing. If Nikizi figures reflect what Congo people believe these spirits look like, though, then we can infer that they look human. This could fit with the previous descriptions of humanoids with webbed feet and long hair. As with many of the previous merbeings that I've covered, shapeshifting from a fish-tailed form to a human-legged one is definitely an option. According to Britannica, a Nikizi is usually created by an Nganga, a spiritual healer, diviner, and mediator, who draws power for the Nikizi from the Bakizi, messengers from the spirit world. This fits with the Bisimbi as not only being associated with nature, but also spiritual beings. And in the African-derived religion Palo Mayombe, Nikizi figures are ritually worshipped. Every Nikizi is said to contain an Impungo, which are nature deities, saints, or spirits derived from traditional Congo religion. All of this points to the Bisimbi being shape-shifting aquatic cryptids. The book Central Africans and Cultural Transformations in the American Diaspora describes the Bisimbi as tutelary spirits of particular territories. They become incarnate as twins and other special children, and they are the principal animating forces in Minkizi. Since the destruction of indigenous polities under colonial rule, the great named spirits are scarcely remembered. Nowadays, Bisimbi are most familiar as anonymous spirits, able to cause trouble if they are not treated with respect. There's a lot in this passage, so let's break it down. First, they are spirits of particular locations, which fits with what we already know about the Bisimbi. These locations are almost certainly bodies of water. The line about becoming incarnate as twins and other special children is particularly interesting, and I will fully admit that I don't know what it means. If anyone knows of more resources on the Bisimbi and Congo mythology, please share in the comments because I want to learn more. Next, they are the principal animating forces in Minkizi. This reinforces the sources we've already looked at that link the Bisimbi to Minkizi. According to this, the Bisimbi were once more powerful and respected, but now are not. This is both common in indigenous religions/cultures impacted by colonialism, but is also a trope in fairy lore. The idea that these beings were once more powerful but now have diminished. This could also be describing a species becoming endangered or becoming extinct. The quote mentions that they once had names. I could only find one reference to an individual name of a simbi. It is a very beautiful name though. The Great Desire of the Unrotting Waters. Lastly, they are able to cause trouble if they are not treated with respect. This is a common thread in much of what I read. Like many water spirits, they can be dangerous, drowning people. More unique, though, is the claim that they can cause rain and flooding, as well as drying up bodies of water, taking away the water that they had given. They are the guardians of water itself. And, according to Breaking the Surface, Mermaids in the Middle Passage, they punish those who transgress against the Bisimbi or those under the Bisimbi's protection. The Bisimbi have a positive, protective side as well. They can influence the fertility and well-being of those living near them. In a story from the Sea Islands off the coast of the Carolinas, a mermaid called Pretty Joe could be summoned via song, and she gave food to an abused and neglected girl. Unfortunately, the story ends sadly, with the mermaid being shot and killed by the girl's father. The girl then went into the water and drowned herself. Many of the themes in this story will recur in the other myths I'm about to discuss. This protective side of Simbis is why they were looked to for help by enslaved Africans when they were brought to the Americas. I also want to interject here that they were also linked to the sea. Some believed that they originated deep in the ocean. This is similar to Mamiwata. This oceanic connection means that they were thought to dwell in the Atlantic Ocean and could follow them to the Americas. This manifested in a variety of stories and events preserved in history and legend. One historical event that is tragically tied to all of this is the Igbo landing. This is a horrible event that frankly isn't talked about enough because it shows so clearly the horror and inhumanity of the slave trade. In 1803, 75 enslaved Africans from the Igbo people, which is not the same as the Congo people, rebelled in Dunbar Creek, Georgia. This is not exactly the same people or area as the enslaved Congo people in the Carolinas with their Simbi spirits, but because of the nature of the slave trade, people got moved around and myths blended, and Georgia isn't that far away from the Carolinas. These Igbo rebels knew that they would be recaptured, so they walked into the creek, still chained to each other. According to oral tradition, they sang, "By the water spirits we came, and by the water spirits we will be taken home." Historical documents from that time report that the bodies of 10 to 12 Igbos and 3 white captors were found in Dunbar Creek. There are no historical markers or memorials at the creek today, which is just criminal. For the purposes of this video though, the water spirits mentioned in the oral tradition may be Cymbees or something similar. Marquetta Goodwine, known as Queen Quet, chiefess of the Gullah Geechee people, a tribe of mixed Native American and African heritage, says that some watching the event said that they flew home. Thus this tragedy became woven into the flying Africans / those who walked into the water type stories about escaping slavery. While some of these stories may have been literally about supernaturally escaping back to Africa, they were also understood symbolically to represent the hope of escaping slavery, either through freedom or death.
Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
So this isn't just a fun myth like some of my other videos. This is deeply linked to the evil of the transatlantic slave trade and the acts of resistance by the Africans affected by it. I want to make sure that I properly acknowledge that. I don't want this video to trivialize something so serious. However, as I've mentioned in many of my previous videos, just because a creature has spiritual or supernatural meaning put on it by a culture, that doesn't mean that it isn't also a real creature. Salmon, wolves, and buffalo are all sacred to various indigenous tribes and are all also physical animals that can be seen and studied by science. To that point, African-American author Toni Morrison wrote about the myth of the supernaturally escaping Africans in her book Song of Solomon. Of the book she said, "The one thing you say about a myth is that there's some truth in there, no matter how bizarre they may seem." Perhaps that is true of the Bisimbi. Now I've spent a lot of time talking about the Bisimbi in the Americas, even though this is a video about African merfolk. Did the Bisimbi actually travel to the Americas with the Congo people? Or did the Congo people call merfolk from the Americas by their name for merfolk? We have new and old world animals in real life where there are similar animals on separate continents. Mer beings could be much the same. However, there doesn't have to be a supernatural explanation for the Bisimbi being on both sides of the Atlantic. Some sea creatures really have ranges that vast. Two populations of humpback whales in the North Atlantic travel from the Gulf of Maine to Norway and then to the West Indies and Cape Verde off the coast of Africa. In 2005, a great white shark traveled from South Africa to Australia, and sperm whales are found in all deep oceans from the equator to the edge of the pack ice in the Arctic and Antarctic. So it is entirely possible that the Bisimbi just have a really big distribution range. Before we get into the speculative biology section of the video though, I want to talk about the Bisimbi's connection to Mami Wata, as well as another related water spirit. Remember Pretty Joe from the Sea Islands? It's possible that her name is related to Mama DeLo, also called Mama DeLo or Mama Glow. In a more modern adaptation of Pretty Joe's story, Suki and the mermaid's name is Mama Jo. All of these names remind me of Mami Wata. So who is Mama DeLo? The name means mother of water, which is very similar to Mami Wata, which means mother water. And I think that it's not a stretch to think that Mama Jo could be a further corruption of Mama Glow. Mama Glow has the upper body of a beautiful woman with long hair and the lower body of an anaconda. So again, we see the snake connection that is also present in the Mami Wata and Cymbee myths. Also, all of these beings are female with fertility and maternity associations. Mama DeLo also punishes those who hurt the environment, much like the Bisimbi. I should mention though that Mama DeLo's myth comes from Trinidad and Tobago and Dominica, which are pretty far south of the Carolinas. However, they were also deeply shaped by the slave trade, and Congo and Igbo people may have been brought there. Are these myths similar because they come from related cultures, or draw from an older, unknown myth from an older culture? Or are they similar because they describe a real African cryptid? The deeper I dig, the more I think that there's really something out there. Let me know in the comments what y'all think. Is there a shared myth, or are there mer beings lurking in the Atlantic? I also want to return to the geese feet. It made me think of sirens who were originally described as bird-like, but later became aquatic. But what if they were always aquatic? What if the bird-like attributes were of waterfowl, like geese? When I thought of that, mind blown. I couldn't believe I'd never thought of that before. Perhaps sirens look a bit like Bisimbi. Look at the feet on this 1st century BC siren. Those look like waterfowl feet to me. Let's move into the speculative biology portion of the video. We'll start with the distribution. Aside from the Atlantic Ocean, which is certainly deep enough to hide any number of mysteries, where in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, Angola, and Gabon could they be hiding? I mentioned Angola's creepy Delolo Lake in my last video, and that's certainly an option. The Great African Lake Kivu and the massive Congo River also fall in this range. I think it's safe to say that there's plenty of places the Bisimbi could be hiding. Their distribution overlaps heavily with Mamiwata. Does this mean that they are actually the same species, or are they competing for resources? This happens all the time in the real world. Crocodiles, lions, and hyenas all share territory, for example. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to treat them as separate species, although they have a number of similarities. One of the key differences is that the Atlantic Ocean plays a much bigger role in the Bisimbi's environment. For this reason, I have put them in a new genus I created, Atlanticus. They will share this genus with the Mingu and Kianda because they are the three African merfolk I feel are the most associated with the Atlantic Ocean. So for the purposes of this speculative biology section, I'm going to imagine that they spend part of their life cycle in the ocean. On the topic of life cycle, you might be wondering, where are the males? This was also a question in my last video, but unlike Mamiwata, who has a rarely mentioned male counterpart in the Papiwata, there seem to be no male Bisimbi at all. If I'm wrong, please tell me in the comments because I'd love to know. The way I see it, we can approach the issue of males in a few ways. I could go the anglerfish route again and assume a male does exist, but it's vestigial and fused to the female, or perhaps the species truly is completely female, like the Brahminy blind snake and the desert grassland whiptail lizard, two real-life all-female species. Or perhaps like parrotfish, they spend part of their life cycle as female and then turn into males when needed for reproduction. Maybe this happens out in the ocean where no human has ever seen. It is also possible that they appear female to us, but are actually hermaphrodites, like the Nomo. I'm going to release a poll alongside this video, and you can vote on which option you think is most likely for the Bisimbi. For my illustration, I'm drawing a feminine Bisimbi. She has long brown hair, a detail drawn from a South Carolina description. Like Mamiwata, the quote-unquote hair is actually spinels, similar to those of the hairy frogfish. She of course has big black eyes, no nose, a tiny mouth, no outer ears, and gills. Like a lungfish, she has both gills and lungs, enabling her to breathe both in and out of the water. She's also able to filter and withstand the unique difficulties of breathing salt water. This Cymbee has primate arms and breasts, which are not directly mentioned in the sources, but are implied. I gave her dark skin, which will help her blend into the dark waters. And her fishtail has the same coloration as Mamiwata and Onegegi/Zen, but the twist of this image is that she is in the middle of shapeshifting into her humanoid form, which has webbed goose-like feet. This, drawn from an alleged eyewitness account, is similar to Mamiwata and Mingu's backwards pointing feet, and is also similar to the global trope of fairy women with one hidden odd bodily feature that identifies them as not quite human. I can imagine a Cymbee on land concealing her goose feet from a lover. And I've stared at so many birds' feet for this research, which sounds pretty funny to me. Egyptian geese do actually range into Central Africa, but they have pretty bright pink feet, which I didn't think really matched the rest of Cymbee's color scheme, so I went with the darker feet of the African pygmy goose, which by the way are really stinking cute. Anyway, let's talk about shapeshifting. I theorized that Mamiwata, Onegegi/Zen, and Nomo can all shapeshift, and I compared it to the real world axolotl. The difference is that for these mer beings, they can shift back and forth between a terrestrial and aquatic form. Is that likely from a scientific perspective? Probably not, but it's fun to think about. I also want to mention another possibility from the incredible book Mer Beings by David Gordsword, Lauren Coleman, and Mark A. Hall. They make a very compelling argument that rather than shapeshifting, these beings might actually be wearing advanced diving suits and equipment that enable them to move from water to land. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Everyone should check it out. This is not sponsored. I wish. I just really like this book and I want y'all to know about it. And this is probably a good time to talk about size. Earlier in the video, I talked about the possibility that the Bisimbi continue growing for their whole lives to fit the size of their habitat. Not only are there real animals like this, goldfish being a notable example, but giant mer beings also appear in lore around the globe. So I think it's likely that the Bisimbi can grow to be much larger than humans, given enough time and space. Speaking of time, what is the Bisimbi's life cycle? Life probably begins in freshwater, where the Bisimbi birth young called fry. They're nursed by their mothers with a milk-like substance that the mothers secrete, much like the discus fish. Like all fish, they can swim immediately after birth, and they breathe through external gills at first until their lungs develop. When they become subadults, they're able to come to the surface and breathe air, as well as shapeshift into their humanoid form. At this age, they travel to the Atlantic Ocean. I have two theories about what happens next. In theory 1, they return to their spawning ground, like Atlantic sturgeon, and birth young. They might do this only once or do this multiple times, growing larger as they age. In theory 2, life actually starts in the ocean and they travel into fresh water as subadults before returning to the ocean to breed and grow to epic sizes. This is my scientific classification for the Bisimbi. As I mentioned, the genus is Atlanticus and the species name I came up with is Atlanticus cymbi. Another important trait of the Bisimbi is that they're only seen at dawn, dusk, or at night. This is further corroborated by the North Carolina legends that say mermaids brush their hair on the shore at night. This is called crepuscular, and there are real-life fish species that are crepuscular. Pearlsides, for instance, come close to the surface at dawn and dusk, and they actually have an entirely unique type of eye cell for seeing, which combines traits of both rod and cone cells. Also, the fact that the Bisimbi are crepuscular while the mommy water are not enables them to both live in the same environment. They are active at different times, lessening the competition between them. Next, I want to talk about how intelligent the Bisimbi are. In pretty much all of the sources we've looked at, the Bisimbi have been highly intelligent, having names, understanding human speech, helping or punishing humans, and potentially having supernatural powers over weather and fertility. How smart you think they are depends on whether you think they're an unidentified animal or something else. If they are simply an undiscovered animal, then many of the supernatural traits and behaviors are myths and aren't literally true. But perhaps they are actually an advanced race, or aliens who use advanced technology to communicate with humans, traverse oceans, and affect the weather. Who can say? I want to end this video with a beautiful poem by Glennis Redmond. Cymbee here, Cymbee there, name her. People of the Congo know her well. Cymbee's spirit must be honored and fed. With each drink, food, dance, and treasure, without ceasing, she finds reasons to mother. Wrap her long arms around her people, across either side of the deep Atlantic.